Welcome, everybody, to the Leaders in Housing Counseling call for April 9th. This is part of our weekly series now on shifting into a world informed by COVID-19 and all its issues. And today's theme is going to be about rental counseling, and we have two experienced experts helping us walk through many of the details here. But also, let me just frame up what's going to be happening over the next with the next call. So many of you, I think, participated in our call last week with FHA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac about how the new mortgage rules will work around forbearance and modification. And we are taking the call next week will be to talk directly with key mortgage servicers about how that will look in the field and how to best communicate with them, what to do with the gaps that aren't covered by the CARES Act, like portfolio loans and private label securities, the more subprime elements of the market. And we will have with us Aquin, Mr. Cooper, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, and may bring in another one or two servicers. But the idea is very specifically how to work with them, how to communicate with them, what are the tools, and do they have systems set up that are meant specifically for counselors, so that the things that are appropriate for consumer-facing intake. But we also really would like to have our own communication networks as we had through the foreclosure crisis. And one of the projects we've been working on and really hope to break through very soon, it's been a little harder than I expected, is to create a directory of all the intake portals that you need to have with servicers, and then which ones have exclusive housing counselor communication channels and potentially escalation lines to make it easier to communicate with people and problem solve with servicers. So that's all to come, and we'll talk next week really on what they've got in place now and how to work with the rule book that is in existence to keep our work going. And we're looking at further down the line to have conversations on things like how to get to closing on mortgages in a world where you're not able to do face-to-face, and what are the elements you need that to help be successful. We're looking at other topics as well, how to deal with the latest technologies, how to manage at a long distance, those kinds of issues. So very interested in if you've got thoughts about who would be good resource people or topics that you think would be helpful to cover right now. We're planning on doing kind of the weekly calls for the immediate future. We'll pivot back when things calm down a little bit, but want to make sure that we're providing kind of the freshest and latest information. We are continuing to work in Congress, and just to give people a quick snapshot, there is a move to get another package of COVID-19 funding, and it's really coming out of the House. It's substantial, and currently there's under discussion in counseling allocation, and we're definitely encouraging that it be spread out a bit over time so that we can have the money work for us over a long period of time rather than just over a short few months. And also trying to make it so that HUD would allow that agencies could use some of these funds for technology and equipment. And there's currently some rules in the way that HUD is doing their current contracts that for housing counseling agencies, we've been pretty limited in being able to do that. Obviously, you've got tremendous equipment and technology needs, and so making that part of allow activities that you can bill for. We also want outreach to be part of it, and of course, training. So there'll be lots of value in this if it passes. We'll see where it goes. Maxine Waters has been very supportive in the House, and she's obviously a key player in this. We'll keep you informed on that and our other efforts as well as we go along. But right now, let's pivot to our topics at hand. We have Seamus Roller, who's the Executive Director of the National Housing Law Project. They have done excellent work around helping explain how the current bill works in terms of for eviction moratoria. Learning that word, I always thought it was moratoriums, but I was clearly wrong. And Laura Phelps, who's the director of United Tenants of Albany, and has been they're doing excellent work. There's decades of experience here in doing the rental counseling work. So this is an area where we feel like there's both the most immediate needs around getting through this current crisis and why people are calling your offices and how we can help them immediately, but also to be thinking about, will this be a bigger part of our work going on in the future? Because essentially the United States has become much more of a renter nation as a result of the foreclosure crisis and the unfortunate spiraling of costs for home ownership and the frustratingly intractable housing markets as the way they're working now. So we may have more of this as part of our portfolio, and hopefully especially Laura's presentation will be helpful around that. We'll make another plug around NHRC membership. We appreciate the fact that some of you are still renewing your members and memberships are joining. I know it's a hard time on organizations, so please do what you can. But we'll all get through this one way or another, and we want to be supportive. And then the next call, as I said, will be on April 16th with mortgage servicers who are active in our field. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ellie, who's done a really great job pulling this whole session together, and let her take it from here. Ellie.
Thanks, Bruce. Hi, everybody. I hope you're all staying safe and keeping your hands cleaned and washed. Our first presenter is Seamus Roller. He's the Executive Director at the National Housing Law Project. And NHLP is a national legal and advocacy center working to strengthen and enforce the rights of tenants, increase housing opportunities for underserved communities, and preserve and expand the nation's supply of safe and affordable homes. Before joining NHLP, Seamus served as the Executive Director of Housing California, a statewide advocacy organization working on issues of housing and homelessness. He started his career running street outreach programs for youth experiencing homelessness and ran a meditation and yoga program for incarcerated youth. He serves on the board of directors of Brilliant Corners and is the board president of the California Association of Nonprofits. Seamus, take it away.
Great, thanks so much for having me. The first thing I want to do is tell Bruce that he wasn't wrong, that either moratoria or moratoriums are both grammatically correct, that you can choose either one. There's been a split within our staff over what's the right approach, but I like moratoriums. It works better for me, so you may hear me use it as well. I always think it's good to, in my work to ground myself in, in our own stories about housing. My parents' house burned down a couple of years before I was born, and they weren't able to rebuild for a long time. I spent the first 2 years of my life living in a garage while my parents were rebuilding the house on the weekends and my brother is 10 years older than me, so he got sick of living in the garage with all of us and was living in the house that was halfway built that just had tarps for walls. So we always sort of laughed thinking about our own stories of sort of housing instability and of making things work, and really want to appreciate all the work that each of you do in kind of helping people, make sense of their lives, to figure out the resources that they need to be successful. And that our job at National Housing Law Project is to help legal services attorneys, but also housing counselors, organizers, other folks that are helping to improve housing stability and housing access for people all around the country. I'm going to talk a lot today about the eviction moratoria at the national level and a little bit about state and local moratoriums, but also we do a fair amount of work around foreclosure and predatory lending as well, specifically Lisa Sitkin on our staff. So there'll be other resources if you want to visit our webpage and see us as a resource around some of that work also. So let's go to the first slide. So The CARES Act eviction moratorium at the very broadest level is a 120-day moratorium on filings for eviction for non-payment of rent, and that started on March 27th when it was passed. It only applies to certain properties, not to every property around the country, much as I might wish that it did, but we'll get into that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So in addition to the 120-day moratorium on evictions, it has an additional requirement that following the end of the moratorium, that the landlord has to issue a 20-day notice before evicting the tenant. This is a little different depending upon what state you're in, but in practice, what that usually means is that that they have to file either the notice to vacate or some other sort of legal document that has to be issued before an eviction can happen. In most states, that means that the tenant can cure the violation during that 30-day period, which means that if you have the money to pay back your back rent, that you can do that during that 30-day period following the 120-day eviction moratorium. It's not in every state, but in most states, that's how it's going to work in practice. So at the earliest is probably 150 days if it's, if the tenant is in a covered property, and with a few other exceptions that we'll get to later. Can I have the next slide, please? So in looking at this, there's a few, the fine print starts to matter. One, I think a lot of people think that this means that they're not responsible for paying rent. Obviously, most of you probably realize that that's not the case. This is just a moratorium on eviction. It means you can't be evicted, but you still have the tenants still have the responsibility for paying rent. And that is really important, I think, to emphasize to people. It may seem simple to you, but I think everybody needs to understand that they're going to owe this rent, and that any reduction in the rent, at least under the current framework that we have throughout most of the country, any reduction in rent has got to be negotiated with the individual landlord. Secondly, this applies only to new filings for eviction, so not ones that were initiated already. So if there was already an eviction process underway, that eviction can still go through underneath the federal law. And it doesn't apply to filings of eviction that occur after the moratorium ends. The biggest exception, and one that I think is going to involve the most litigation and the most heartburn overall, is that in the drafting, that this only applies to eviction for non-payment of rent and other fees and charges, but it's not to eviction for criminal activity. So if if you're starting a fire in the middle of your living room, or you beat up your property manager, right, you still can get evicted for that. The real question is sort of what's going to happen around those situations in which a landlord issues an eviction for no cause. Most places in the country, you can have a no-cause eviction as long as you're not under a one-year lease or other sort of longer-term lease. So with a no-cause eviction, the real question is going to be, is that no-cause eviction really driven by the tenant's non-payment of rent? So there's going to be some arguments in there about sort of how that works in practice and what courts are really willing to do around a no-cause eviction. My guess is in a lot of places, courts are going to be pretty unwilling to take a no-cause eviction right now, given the pressure that the courts are under and other things. But it really depends on where you are. And so if you're involved in this, I would certainly encourage you to tell tenants that if you think they should argue that they can't be evicted for a no-cause eviction if the real underlying issue is that they haven't been paying rent. The last thing, and that we'll go into next, so we'll go to the next slide, please, is that this only applies to some properties, that it's not the full suite of rental properties all around the country. So the first is that it applies to all of the federally subsidized housing programs. That includes public housing, the Section 8 voucher program, project-based Section 8. There's a program called the Section 202 Housing for the Elderly, 811. There's a whole bunch of these programs. So basically, any of the HUD programs. There's also a huge portfolio of programs that are subsidized by the Department of Agriculture under the Rural Development Department. And then additionally, all of the low-income housing tax credit programs as well are covered by this eviction moratorium. One of the key things around the federal programs is that almost all of those have some good cause requirement as well. So you're not going to see, well, you shouldn't see no cause evictions within those programs. So you're sort of like the suite of tenant rights around those programs is going to be pretty strong. There's going to be some, I think, problems with the low-income housing tax credit program because that's administered by the IRS, and they do a pretty weak job of regulating how things go. And so I think you'll probably see some tax credit properties, tenants who are living in tax credit properties who are getting no cause evictions. If you see that, you really need to tell them that they have good cause under the statute and and shouldn't be able to be evicted for no cause. The big sort of confusing part around this is that it also applies to both apartments and single family homes with a federally backed mortgage loan. This includes, Fannie and Freddie, the Federal Housing Finance Administration, USDA, HUD, VA. You all probably know this better than I do because this is, more on the lending side. What I've heard from the National Multifamily Housing Council is that approximately half of the properties that their members have are covered in this section. So that means a lot of bigger apartment buildings are going to fit in there. The numbers are less clear on the single family side. About 70% of mortgage loans are federally backed overall, but I think it's a much smaller percentage of the single family homes that are rented out are covered by a federally backed mortgage loan and therefore covered by the eviction moratorium. The other hard part of this is that there's, as I see it, very little way for a tenant to know in practice whether they're covered by the eviction moratorium if the property they live in fits in this second category. So you could, in most cases, it's going to be recorded. So the county recorder's office is going to have these documents, but not many county recorders have these documents available online. And my guess is that most of your county recorder's offices are closed, and they certainly don't want a lot of people walking in to, ask for documents and trading documents back and forth across the desk. So there's going to be some real challenges. So I think, one, when you talk to tenants, you want to have them ask their landlords whether their property is covered, whether they have a federally backed mortgage loan, whether the landlord's going to tell them or not. Just creates a lot of problems back and forth about helping tenants understand whether they're covered. I know some folks in Florida who are starting to try to put together a database around this, some other people. And our hope is that the newest version of the stimulus is going to have at least some data component, or maybe that they'll expand the eviction moratorium across the board nationally, which I think is the simplest way to handle it at this point. Can I have the next slide, please? So, I wish I had better advice for all of you to sort of, about how to figure that component out, but it's going to be, maybe you can provide some feedback to me as you start to work with tenants about any of the strategies that worked for you. I would love to hear about those so that I can give other people better advice as we move forward. So here's just some basic advice about advice for struggling renters. One is that they really, there's so much uncertainty in all this. They really need to let their landlord know. And that, some landlords are not good, but many of them are anticipating, right, that their tenants are going to have problems, and that the sooner that you can kind of work this out and maybe figure out a plan that works, that's really going to be the best situation, I think, for everybody involved. There's going to be some real exceptions, right? You're going to know who the terrible landlords are, who's already sending out ridiculous notices to their tenants. Maybe you're going to know some of that and you're going to give different advice. You want to explain the federal moratorium, but also that you're going to want to know whether there's any state or local moratorium in effect as well. And this is pretty complicated also because there may be a statewide moratorium that was instituted by the governor, and those are the cleanest and easiest to understand. But in, where I live in California, we have sort of one that the governor issued, which is not very effective. We also have the Judicial Council, and so the courts have essentially shut down all the evictions. And then there's a whole patchwork of local moratoriums as well. And of course, none of those dates match up on which one's in effect at any given time. So you're going to really want to understand what your local situation is whether the courts are actually hearing unlawful detainer cases, because that may really affect whether somebody's going to get evicted. The other thing I want to point out is that lots of landlords are going to go through other processes to try and get tenants out of their properties. And so, that you need to help sort of guide them through, like, their landlord sends them a letter that says, I'm evicting you and you have to move out. Like, that's not how it works, right? They need to get a legal eviction notice in order to be forced to move out. And then they should, probably appear in any court hearing that moves forward as well. And that you ought to, advise them to talk to their legal services organization if they're getting harassed or if there's an eviction moving forward, that they ought to get legal help during this time to make sure that their rights are preserved during this time. Come to the next slide, please. And even I would say there's the way the statute is written, there may be a whole chunk of other properties that in which people can raise this defense, even if they don't technically fit into, even if they don't technically fit into the sort of two categories that I laid out. There's some sort of legal disagreement over whether if, a 500 unit apartment building accepts one person with the housing choice voucher, all of the units within that building may be subject to the eviction moratorium as well. So it's, some of the stuff is yet to play out. I started to talk a little bit about this, which is, illegal evictions. We're seeing this all around the country. Sometimes somebody's going to, go out to the grocery store and they're going to come home and the locks are going to be changed on their apartment. There's going to be intimidation. There's going to be the landlord, disconnecting utilities. So lots of illegal evictions are going to happen during this time. And so I think you want to encourage people that are encountering this and that are worried about this to know that the courts will still be open to hear these, that they need to reach out to legal services or to reach out to law enforcement as well, right? To make sure that their rights are protected, that they're not, sitting outside the door of their apartment waiting for something to happen, that they have resources that they can access. Next slide, please. So, just understanding this can be a real challenge overall. There are a handful of resources here that are available on our website. We list we have a written up summary of what the eviction moratorium and what it looks like. There's also a summary of the foreclosure moratorium and the forbearance. But we also have, we've been working with both the eviction lab and the professor at Columbia, tracking all the state and local eviction moratoriums. So you can go here and figure out whether there is something covering your local area. So I'm not guaranteeing this is 100% right, but it at least gives you a pretty good starting place to understand sort of what your local situation is. The last one bullet point here is the preservation database. This lists almost all of the federally subsidized programs. So these are going to be all the apartments that fit into the first category. This is going to have your HUD properties, your Department of Agriculture, and your tax credit properties are going to be listed on the preservation database. And you can that can help you understand whether a tenant fits into that category if the apartment that they're in is one of those. So we'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later, also in questions, but thinking about also what other resources you have to help tenants out there. So you have in the federal stimulus program, what you have is about $5 billion in what's called the Community Development Block Grant that goes out to individual jurisdictions on a formula basis. They tweaked the formula a little bit in the federal stimulus bill, but it goes out to your local cities. There's also $4 billion in the Emergency Solutions Grant, which is a program that is primarily designed to assist people who are homeless or on the verge of becoming homeless. $2 billion goes into the regular pot, but there's $2 of the $4 billion is really there to provide eviction defense money and to keep people from being evicted. So it's dollars that can be used to provide rental assistance. And so making sure that you access whoever your local emergency solutions grant and knowing who administers that, it's most likely either to be, you know, it's going to go through a city or the county or your local housing authority, but certainly your local continuum of care, which manages the homeless services programs at your local city or in your local community. They're going to know kind of who administers and what the mechanism is to access those dollars. So you ought to know that so you can help refer people out to those programs also. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and turn it back to the rest of you.
Thank you, Seamus. That was a lot of really great information. So we are now going to go to Laura Feltz, who's the Executive Director at United Tenants in Albany. And United Tenants has been around and helping tenants since 1973. And Laura started at United Tenants as a community organizer a few years ago, and has been doing a lot of really great work with United Tenants and is now the Executive Director. So Laura, take it away.
Thanks, Ellie. Thank you all for having us on today. United Tenants, like Ellie said, has been around since 1973, so we've been doing this work on the ground with tenants for about 50 years now. Our mission is to protect and promote tenants' rights to safe, decent, and affordable housing with special emphasis on those who have the greatest need or who experience the most severe problems, and we promote the development and preservation of more affordable housing. When we first formed, we really targeted and fought against code enforcement in the 70s and 80s demanding reform. We were very responsive to the needs of tenants on the ground. And then in the 80s and 90s, we focused on forming other community-based organizations that still exist, including the Albany Community Land Trust, the Affordable Housing Partnership, the Albany Community Loan Fund, and now we still work very closely with those organizations to meet the needs of our community. And then in the 90s, we created a homeless prevention program to address the rampant displacement of tenants that we were seeing during that time. And now we provide a whole bunch of different services to the community to meet the needs of renters. So we run a housing hotline, we have emergency rental assistance service, we provide a court advocacy service, we do intermediary assistance at the local DSS, we have a drop-in center, we do counseling for tenants in foreclosed properties, we do education for tenants and for landlords in the Capital Region. We do education for other organizations and services for providers and community organizations. We assist with the formation of tenant associations, and we do local community organizing on the ground and legislative advocacy. We are a rare certified HUD housing counseling agency that really focuses only on providing rental counseling. We do not provide home ownership services. We really leave that to the experts at the organizations that I just mentioned. And so we do a lot of work on the ground with tenants. And with that, I can kind of move into what I'm going to talk about. So the renter needs that we're seeing on the ground with COVID-19 at United Tenants, kind of having the housing hotline and the direct services that we have, we hear a lot right from the folks who are the hardest hit by these problems. We're seeing that it's people that are experiencing homelessness, low-income renters, and small landlords who are really, really being hit by this already when we've really only been enduring this crisis for a short period in the scheme of really how long this is probably going to go on. We're also seeing that bad player landlords and oppressive landlord behaviors are even more prevalent at this time and will likely continue to spike. We're going to see that those huge corporate landlords who tend to be the bad players are probably not going to be very impacted by this crisis overall, and that in some cases they're probably going to profit off of it. We're seeing mass evictions, and we're certainly seeing that the courts are going to be overloaded. So while there's an eviction moratorium in New York State right now, and then we're further covered by the federal eviction moratorium that Seamus just talked about, we know that mass evictions are coming down the pike. Already, when things were quote unquote normal, 5,000 eviction proceedings for summary proceedings were filed in our local city court in Albany, New York every year, and our population is only 25,000 renter households. So we were already seeing that an extreme number of households were facing eviction every year in the city of Albany when we were not in the midst of a public health crisis that's going to have enormous economic fallout. We're seeing an overwhelming inability among tenants to pay their rent. Many renter households live paycheck to paycheck. So having lost income now for weeks, and then in some cases, folks may not have income for months, people are not able to make ends meet. When things, again, were normal, 30 to 50% of renters in Albany were cost burdened with their rent expenses, so they had to spend more than 30% of their monthly household income on their rent every month. That was when their income was normal and things were flowing. So we're already seeing a lot of tenants calling in who are not able to make ends meet and weren't able to pay their rent in March and in April, and foresee not being able to pay their rent in May and in June. We're seeing a lot of unlawful evictions and illegal lockouts. We just had a landlord the other day board up someone's door and not allow them to access their unit. So utility shutoffs, discontinuance of essential services, landlord harassment. We're seeing threatening notices, massive rent increases. So sort of putting in place that mechanism to ensure that a tenant will be evicted as soon as the moratoriums lift. Ensuring that a tenant will be in a place of non-payment of rent if they've done anything to assert their rights during this time. We're seeing horrible issues with some conditions, tenants really trapped in these apartments with bad conditions because code enforcement bureaus are not functioning as normal. And tenants really don't have many rights to get repairs made in their apartments, even in a state like New York that's a little bit more progressive in affording rights to renters. We're hearing a lot of fear of shelters, so tenants who are forced out of their homes during this time, or tenants who are already unstably housed and sort of on the brink of losing their housing before this happened, are very afraid to go into shelter and access shelters because of the fear of the spread of COVID in those congregate spaces, and we're seeing a lot of tenants choosing to sleep outside. So those are really the major things that we've been seeing in these past few months. So to meet those needs, I think United Tenants really has it right in the way that we serve the community. So what's really important is to provide direct services that are informed by the community. So when we really came into being in 1973, it was in response to two legendary community organizers listening to the people who were experiencing these problems and putting those folks at the front of policy efforts and putting those folks' needs at the forefront of their minds as they started to craft direct services in a framework for meeting the needs of the community. So we still provide assistance through a hotline, and it's the same phone number that we had a very long time ago. We provide drop-in services for people so people can just walk right in, certainly not right now while we're in a shelter-in-place order, but we have it very accessible for tenants to be able to call us and reach us in just about any way. We're always kind of focusing on education and empowerment, so making sure that those community-informed services have a lot to do with informing tenants about what their rights are and really teaching them the function and the applicability of how those rights can be enforced. So we provide financial assistance to folks when they have emergency needs, and we're very much present in the spaces where evictions and tenant oppression happens. So we are physically in courts at Department of Social Services. We're at code enforcement bureaus, having these conversations with the people on the other end and making sure that tenants' rights are being protected and promoted in those spaces. It's really important to maintain community relationships. So know the entities in your community and who within those entities is set up to help tenants dealing with eviction issues. So who at DSS or your social service agency, who in your legal service providers and your advocacy organizations is set up with the tools and the knowledge to help tenants. And really, as housing counseling organizations, we need to take the lead on educating the community about what tenants' rights are and what the needs of renters are. So United Tenants provides education at the Department of Social Services. We educate the Albany Police Department and landlords on what tenants' rights are so that we know that those things are being respected out in the community as much as is possible. It's really important to understand systems, so not just serving the tenants and telling them what their rights are, but really having knowledge about what tenant issues are police matters, what issues need to go to court, what can be dealt with through an administrative process like a fair housing issue, and then maintaining relationships with folks in those entities and training them and educating them and being at the forefront as these things change and shift. I think the National Housing Law Project and Seamus, who we just heard from, they do such a great job of knowing what's happening at the policy level and then really digesting that and sharing that information out to the rest of the community. And as rental counseling agencies that are working with tenants, we really have to stay at the forefront of policy issues, understand how those issues are going to play out in systems, and be leaders in educating folks within those systems about how we should be respecting the rights of tenants. We need to be advocates for basic human dignity because, you know, the dignity of tenants is often at stake and is often not entirely respected. So tenants overwhelmingly, especially here in Albany, don't live in safe, decent, and affordable housing. And so we're having to constantly advocate for these very basic human rights to a safe place to live that doesn't make someone sick or doesn't make them unable to afford groceries and basic necessities. And seeking codification of those rights to basic human dignity in local, state, and federal laws. So ensuring that those things really become solidified in our communities so that the rights of tenants are safe and followed. Pushing for eviction moratoriums and widespread barring of evictions really needs to be occurring on a national level. I think Seamus put it very well that, you know, we're seeing a lot of stronger eviction moratoriums coming down the pike and at municipality, at the level of the municipality or at the state level. And we really need to see the federal government pick up and cover the whole country because things are happening so piecemeal and tenants really need to know that they're safe and secure in their housing as we're kind of enduring this public health crisis. And looking at housing as a human right. So knowing that, you know, a lack of housing, I think we see puts people experiencing homelessness at risk of exposure to COVID-19. People who don't have housing right now are at serious risk of becoming ill and also at subsequently spreading the virus to other people. And I think we need to really realize that this was always the case. People experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity have always had disproportionate health issues and have always been disproportionately at risk of becoming sick and becoming ill. We see at United Tenants all the time that so many of our clients have comorbid health issues and face such an enormous level of issues with their health. And a lot of that stems from being evicted multiple times, experiencing chronic homelessness and experiencing housing instability. The national housing crisis and the overwhelming housing instability and homelessness that folks are facing is and always has been a public health crisis. And it's never been more important to act on that. We know too that when things, again, were quote unquote normal, over 500,000 people in New York State were sleeping on the streets in any given night, and that millions of people across the United States were cost burdened with their rent already. So as housing counseling organizations, we really need to be focusing on providing permanent housing to all people that's safe, decent, and affordable, particularly focusing on people who are homeless or who are at risk of homelessness, if we're really to protect ourselves and the folks in our community from some of the issues that we see with a public health crisis like COVID-19. So the last thing I was going to talk about just a little bit, but I think Seamus did a great job overviewing this, but there's a lot of assistance for tenants that we're seeing come through the CARES Act, and we are hoping to see some more come through in the next package that seems to be coming down the pike. So like he said, there was $4 billion in the CARES Act, and a lot of community-based organizations are really pushing to see at least $11.5 billion to be included for ESG in the next package. Who knows if that will actually happen, but I can say that we're seeing the need for rental assistance at United Tenants for at-risk folks who are facing eviction and imminently at risk of losing their housing. We're seeing that spike extremely, and we're definitely going to need to see a really big investment in that. And just emphasizing that a great way to see where that funding exists in your community is to reach out to your Continuum of Care, COC, and that you can check HUD's website to look at the Community Planning and Development Formula Program allocations. It's CPD Formula Program allocations to know where this money is going through in your community. And that's going to be similar for CDBG and HOPWA funding. And just keeping in mind that housing choice vouchers and project-based rental assistance did receive some funding in the CARES package. So hopefully we'll be seeing more vouchers available to folks who are having difficulty affording their housing. So that's all for me.
Great, thanks. So we do have quite a few questions. So I am going to run through those.
Ellie, while you're doing that, could I ask one quick question quickly? So, Laura.
Go for it.
So, Laura, when you're not, what other funding is there for rental counseling outside of the CARES Act? So, how would a counseling program have a funding package to do rental counseling day by day or after the crisis?
So we do receive funding. Like I said, we're a certified HUD housing counseling agency, so some of our funding does come from HUD, and that is available to do rental counseling. ESG is a fairly reliable source of funding to help with homelessness prevention and eviction prevention efforts, which is going to fall under rental counseling and helping people who are tenants. And then a lot of the other sources of funding are going to really vary by state. A lot of the support that we get here comes from programs that are administered by the New York State government. And then we get a lot of funding from foundations and other kind of like local efforts that seek to help people who are low income and dealing with housing instability.
Thanks.
Okay, so I guess this could go to either one of you. Somebody's asking if there are any resources for small landlords that might have only 2 or 3 homes in rental status. Is there any funding for them to get them through their hardship, especially if they're not getting their rent from their tenants?
So I think for, a lot of landlords are eligible, if they're covered by the federal eviction moratorium, they're also eligible for forbearance under their program. So they'll be eligible for accessing forbearance under the federal CARES Act as well under those provisions. I think there'll be other people who sort of fall through those cracks, who will be covered by a state or local moratorium, but who won't have a federally backed mortgage loan and won't be able to access the forbearance. It's partially why you also see the National Multifamily Housing Council. They're advocating for massive emergency rental assistance too, because I think, the best way to make sure that landlords get paid is to make sure that tenants have money to pay rent.
And also there's some HUD housing counseling agencies that do more home ownership work that sometimes can help with loan modifications and other programs that help landlords and homeowners to be able to stabilize their situation.
Okay, somebody is asking for a...
Wait, I was just going to say, the other tool that we should really make sure everybody's paying attention to is to make sure that tenants who have lost their income apply for unemployment insurance, unemployment compensation, because it's actually going to pay much better than regular unemployment, and it's a way of getting income back into the household. So you should become very familiar with how to do that. It's often online in states and highly accessible.
That's really important, Bruce. I mean, and I think also for people who are sort of sole proprietors who are not eligible for who may be eligible for unemployment. So there's sort of a different group of people than was normally eligible. So right, if you're a gig worker driving for Uber, or there are other people who didn't used to be eligible for unemployment but will be under the stimulus package, and also people who own their own business may be eligible for some of the other programs to sort of keep getting income coming in through their small business.
And it's a really good program. One of the things that I'm glad Laura brought that up is many of your programs have helped people who own a duplex or own a triplex or even a 4-unit building, and those are all eligible for forbearance tools and may help people get through this. And it's often an important source of affordable housing in local communities.
I think the last thing that any of the tenants' rights folks want to see is that all of the sort of smaller landlords are gone, and what we replace them with is, some version of Blackstone or, some other giant equity company that owns all the rental properties.
Absolutely. Okay, Ellie, what else have you got?
Okay. So somebody wanted to get a quick recap of the California court shutdown of evictions, and also asking if there's something that other state courts are doing. And I think actually, Seamus, you did answer the second part of that question by providing the link to the site that shows what the different programs and processes are in different states.
Yeah, sure. So, I use California as an example of just how complicated this can be. If you're like where I am in San Francisco, we have an eviction moratorium locally in the city of San Francisco. The governor has issued a moratorium, which doesn't, like, they didn't actually understand landlord-tenant law when they did it, so it's not really effective. But then the Judicial Council, which sets the rules of the courts, just shut down essentially all unlawful detainer proceedings through most of the summer. So you can't go through with an eviction that way. So I think, you also want to know if the state government has passed anything and whether there's a local ordinance around this, but you also need to pay attention to what's actually happening within the court systems and whether unlawful detainers fall within the kind of emergency actions that courts are still taking or not, because in many cases they can be, in many cases the courts have shut down all eviction proceedings as well.
Do either of you have any information about individuals who are resident aliens and not eligible for unemployment? Are there any programs for them? I don't know if this is a question about undocumented immigrants or what specifically, but at any rate.
So
I think that might depend on kind of where somebody lives locally, but Seamus, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
No, please do. Go ahead. The other thing I would say too is that you're still the same sort of, the eviction moratorium applies regardless of your immigration status, right? You still can't be evicted even if you're undocumented under the provisions of this. But yeah, I think there's major issues, and when I've been talking to people and talking to reporters about this, they're like, well, shouldn't that take care of it? Shouldn't everybody be able to pay their rent? And I was like, well, I mean, there's so many people who don't qualify for unemployment, whether that's because of immigration status. I think about like my aunt, my mom sends my aunt money to help her make, to get through and to make her rent payments and stuff like that. And if my mom's income were to go down, that would really affect my aunt, right? There are all these other people who, for various reasons, who are working for cash, who are working under the table, won't see the same benefits from unemployment. And also in some high-cost cities, even unemployment won't be enough to help people make their rent payments.
A lot of community-based organizations like United Tenants too maintain, if an organization does a great deal of rental assistance, they'll maintain some reserves of like foundation and local donations and serve people who often fall through the cracks with like their DSS or with something like unemployment. A private nonprofit might still be able to serve that person with financial assistance.
Okay. Does the eviction moratorium still apply if a tenant is living in a covered property, for instance, an FHA loan, that's already gone through a foreclosure and is in a redemption period? Is the buyer of the foreclosed property still covered by the eviction moratorium? What it sounds like is the tenant is living in a covered property that already went through foreclosure, and there's another buyer who's buying the foreclosed property. Is it still covered by the eviction moratorium? What I'm not clear about is whether or not the new buyer has an FHA loan or not.
Yeah, so assuming the new buyer doesn't have an FHA loan, I think this would probably qualify under sort of the no cause, right? It's not for non-payment of rent. The real question that if I was the attorney, what I would argue in that case is that the eviction is actually for non-payment of rent in that situation. especially if the new buyer has some sort of federally backed mortgage loan of some kind. But I think you start to get pretty fact specific at that point. And so we'd be happy to help, have you out. I think there's some foreclosure issues there, and our attorney who works on foreclosure issues could be helpful if you want to follow up individually.
So along those same lines, somebody is asking if there's any kind of toll-free number that clients can be referred to get information and guidance.
So there are often, if you go to lawhelp.org, there are often statewide numbers for tenants and for legal services. There's no national number for tenant-related issues. A number of people have talked to me about whether we want to set one up in the midst of all this, and there's such a diversity of landlord-tenant law all across the country that sort of state by state tends to make more sense, and our organization would have to be 10 times the size if we were going to provide that level of detailed, advice on for tenants.
Somebody else just suggested using 211 as a potential resource.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, so for the sake of renter protection, is military housing pay considered a subsidy?
No.
Folks in the military often have pretty good eviction protections from other acts too, so it would be worth looking into with your state laws.
Yeah, but I don't think that's not considered a subsidy under the CARES Act under the provision 1, but that doesn't, I think it's important, as Laura pointed out, to sort of understand what the other protections are, and it's not an area we've practiced in significantly.
So we have somebody who's just wondering if anybody's hearing anything about issues with landlords wanting to evict tenants who are in essential jobs like healthcare, grocery stores, and want to evict them for fear of bringing the virus into the home.
Yes, we have been seeing a ton of that. We've also been seeing landlords post these arbitrary notices on people's doors stating that they're not allowed to leave their units or that they're not allowed to have people come in from outside into the building. And, people have situations where they're providing childcare, providing care to others, but certainly folks don't have to abide by those kinds of rules that their landlords are attempting to put out there. They just need to follow whatever executive orders and rules are being put out there by their government and by the folks who have the power to make those rules. And then while many areas lack good cause eviction protections, certainly while there's eviction moratoriums at your state and local levels, or if that person lives in housing that's protected by this federal moratorium that Seamus just explained, kind of knowing your rights and your protections against no cause evictions are really important.
Okay, somebody just wanted to share that Housing Choice Voucher Program staff have been deemed essential, and as an organization that administers the program, they're trying to do business as usual as much as possible, which I'm sure most of them are. So they are still inspecting units, pulling new vouchers, performing rental counseling, etc. Just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, they are, but I think that in practice, what we've heard from a lot of people is that trying to get your housing authority on the phone, depending upon who, what that housing authority is, can be a real challenge. So that can, one of the things you might run into is, if you talk to somebody who has a housing choice voucher, is living in public housing, they should be able to get a recertification of their income if their income is decreased dramatically, which should lower their rent, but getting a hold of somebody may be a challenge within the housing authority. But we're really encouraging people who are living in HUD programs or in USDA programs to notify their housing authority that their income is decreased if it has.
Okay, speaking to state level funding, somebody just wanted to let us know that in New Jersey, there is rental counseling funds available to housing counseling agencies through the governor's COVID order. So a good point to make that people should check out what is available at the state level. Somebody's asking if there's been any lobbying that anyone's aware of to open up more Section 8 vouchers at the federal level, but this person is asking for Illinois in particular.
So from what I've heard, that the big push has been around emergency rental assistance, and so that's likely to go through the ESG program. There's this push for another, maybe as much as $100 billion in more emergency rental assistance. I would love to see an expansion of the voucher program. It's certainly the big push for an organization called the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities that does a lot of housing work that we partner with quite a bit. And that's been their push for years, which is a voucher entitlement program. And we're certainly in favor of that at NHLP. It just seems like that's expansion of vouchers probably not in the cards for the next stimulus package. But given that, the disruptions to the housing market are likely to last for a long time, there may be opportunities to push for something like that in the future.
And with the Homes Guarantee work, which is a national advocacy group, there's some advocacy to repeal the Faircloth Amendment that makes it so that new public housing can't be built, and kind of gets at some of those caps that we see with funding permanently affordable housing. It's something important to try to advocate for.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so this is a two-part question. Number one, should a landlord accept partial rental payments? And number two, if a pending rental eviction order was issued prior to the pandemic, will that be enforced when the courts reopen?
On our end, we're pretty sure that's going to depend a little bit, because in some cases you see the acceptance of rent sometimes vitiating or canceling an eviction action, but it's going to depend case by case on how that might turn out. And we're not sure how, so generally, at least in New York State, statute of limitations and other kind of things that interact and make a warrant of eviction expire or go stale got put on hold. So we're unclear whether the warrants are still going to be executable or not when this is lifted, or if the landlords might have to start over.
Yeah, the CARES Act only prevents the filing of new eviction actions for non-payment of rent. So I think Laura's right on this, is that, maybe the CARES Act doesn't explicitly, but I think how it's going to play out in practice at the end is really up in the air.
Okay, so just to put a fine point on it, if I am a landlord with a Fannie Mae owned loan, I cannot evict my tenants for no cause. Is that correct?
You can't evict your tenants for non-payment of rent. Whether you can evict them for no cause is a really murky area of the law right now. I think most courts are going to be pretty, pretty reluctant to go through that without eviction, especially if it smells at all like it's because they're not paying rent.
I like that, if it smells at all like that. Yeah. Somebody's asking where a tenant can complain for landlords that are trying to disobey this executive order.
So I would, depending upon the situation, right? I would, if you have a counseling agency like Laura's, it's a great place to start. But otherwise, most people, I would refer to their local legal aid organization to go there as a great place to start. If it's more urgent, contacting law enforcement, I think, is the place to go, right? If you're being harassed or threatened, if you're endured in an illegal lockout, sort of different strategies around this depending upon how bad it is.
Okay. I want to let everybody know this has come up a few times. We will make this a recording of this presentation available, and I will attach the PowerPoint to it as well. We should be able to get it to you by the end of the day tomorrow, Monday at the latest. So look out for that. Somebody also is just mentioning that there are already scams going on out there to try to separate vulnerable people from their stimulus checks.
And we want to know a lot more about those. So anything you can do, send them to us, please. We're trying to get an inventory of what we're seeing on the country, but it's part of, and those stories, that survey that Ellie has put out, please feed things into that. This is going to be a vital piece to our trying to elevate these issues in the world's housing counseling with the media and with policymakers.
There's also too just issues about whether someone, a debt collector can access those stimulus funds, and so National Consumer Law Center has been doing some work around sort of how to help people protect their checks from debt collection. Laura, I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate at all on sort of my response on sort of what to do if somebody's been doing, if a landlord's trying an illegal eviction. If you had it with us.
Yeah, you did a good job. I was just gonna maybe chime in, and I was like, I don't know, I think you got it. But
you handle this more than I do on a day-to-day basis.
I think because there's so many places that are super under-resourced in the way of rental counseling, it can be really important to remember that it's kind of a political issue when that happens. So reaching out to your local legislators, if you have council members, or depending on how your local legislation kind of framework is set up. And it's also an issue that should be brought to the media, right? We're in a public health crisis where shelter-in-place orders are flying around like crazy. And if landlords are going to this degree of kind of forcing someone out, like we had a landlord board up somebody's door and try to force them to sleep outside, it's an issue that should be brought to the press. If people have some kind of a press connection and can, that's a story that should be put out there, and that person should be shamed. So.
Yeah. I think too, building on that, it's like this, so many times have I been asked about like, well, why can't tenants pay their rent? Shouldn't they be able to pay their rent? And part of it, I think we have this moment to change the dialogue around that, which is that like we're bailing everybody out, right? We know that businesses need assistance from the federal government. We know that landlords need assistance. We know that their employees need assistance in all of this. And so the idea that we think that somehow everybody can pay their rent in the middle of all this without any assistance is a kind of, it's an absurdity, and we need to sort of challenge that basic idea that, in the midst of all of us getting some level of bailout around the country as a result of this crisis, tenants need that as well.
Thank you, Seamus. Yes.
Somebody did ask Laura to elaborate on what ESG stands for, the ESG grant that you mentioned.
Emergency Solutions Grant stems from the McKinney-Vento Act and is useful for homelessness services and homelessness prevention, eviction prevention services.
And who manages that? What entity should somebody go to find out about that?
Yeah, it comes down from HUD, from the federal government, and it goes through the Community Planning and Development Formula Program Allocations process. So I could even like type this out in an email maybe to Ellie or something, because I know this is a mouthful. So it goes through that allocation process, and you can look on HUD's website to see whether your area is getting an allocation of ESG funding. And generally, those allocations are going to go through what's called a continuum of care, COC. So that it'll go through the municipality, and then it'll come through the COC, and then organizations should work with their COC to access that funding to be able to serve their communities.
Please type that up. That would be great.
Yeah, and then in the rural areas, if you're not covered by a continuum of care or you're in a small community, the rest of the money is what's called a balance of state, which means it goes to the state government, and then the state selects an entity, or in some cases manages itself, that provides the ESG funding to those areas which don't have their own allocation.
Great. Yeah, Laura, if you type that up and get it to me, I will include it in the email that goes out with the link to the recording and PowerPoint. And that covers, oh wait, with child support already being leveled from tax returns, also levy the stimulus checks.
That is beyond my area of expertise.
I heard that child support was going to be one of the only things that would be an allowable garnishment of a stimulus check, but I would agree that that has kind of been swirling around, and I'm not totally clear on all of the information around that.
And I believe that that covers the questions.
Thank you very much. This has been really helpful. We will do this as recording so people can tap into it, and others who aren't able to make the call will be able to join us. And also remind you that we had CHN, the Cleveland Housing Network, on a couple months ago to talk about their eviction intervention program with the United Way and the Seniors Institute, which is also another kind of model for how to do this work and really help intervene on what are clearly critical issues for tenants. So with that quick note, big thanks to our presenters. Quick reminder to join NHRC if you haven't already, and thanks to the many groups that have renewed this year already. We do understand that you're under a lot of pressure, and we appreciate it if this is a time when you can still do that. Obviously, take care of your organizational priorities first, but we really deeply appreciate the fact that so many of you have continued to be supporters even in some of the downtime. So it really makes a difference. Actually, I want to send something out about this, but Savvy, the online tool for student debt, which we think is a pretty high quality thing. This is the one that's done by somebody who left the CFPB and some student advocates. It's we have a great deep dive on it on a previous call. There was a charging structure for it. We got a discount. They are actually doing it for free now for the through I think July 1, so that it can help people who obviously are in a big challenging thing. And they have also updated their piece to fit into the CARES Act. So that's a really useful tool in the work we're doing. And we'll continue with the discount we've got on the credit reports for members of NHRC. We also send out occasional interesting funding opportunities that are outside of the mainstream that you might not know about, and that goes to members as well, and occasionally some media opportunities as well. But the real thing is to support the work, because we're all in this together, and we have really had a big impact on funding levels, and we continue to do that work. But certainly we understand that it's not an easy time for organizations, and we appreciate that as well. So quickly, next week we're going to have our call this time with the mortgage servicers. So 2 weeks ago we had FHA and Fannie and Freddie about the CARES Act and what it looks like around forbearance policies, what their standards are going to be. What we wanted to do was to get some the servicers, that's actually the ones you'll interface with, to talk about how they view implementing those programs. Be also clear about the parts that of the mortgage system that aren't covered by them, so private label securities, the typical subprime market, and portfolio loans, some of which are the CRA kinds of loans that we do a lot of work with. And then also to talk about the communication channels that they've got, and really try to encourage them to develop one specifically for housing counselors as well. So with that, we're going to, and remember, we're going to start at 1:15 again. This seems to be, we no longer seem to have crashing calls, and they seem to be working pretty well, and we're able to handle several hundred participants. So big thanks for everybody. Again, if you haven't filled out the survey that Ellie circulated about the collecting stories, we really need those. This is helpful. We're very interested in what's happening with your clients out in the field, what's happening with your organization and the impact, but also any scams and predatory things that you see in the field. So with that, thanks for all your good work. We'll let you go, and we'll talk to you next week.